2, 1. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our conversation, our Torah study today with Rabbi David Abrahamovitz, a very good personal friend of mine and a leader in Holocaust education. I've had the opportunity to go with Rabbi David to Poland, and he leads an unforgettable experience to Poland for Jews and for non-Jews, and really helps people understand what the Holocaust was about. And today is Yom Hashoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, where everybody is pausing for a moment to think about the devastation of the Holocaust and to stand in solidarity with the 6 million, to remember the 6 million, to pledge never to forget. And really, we have an opportunity as well to help Holocaust survivors. We are still blessed with Holocaust survivors in our midst. Israel has just under 200,000 Holocaust survivors. And I say just under because that's important. Last year, there was about 205,000 Holocaust survivors. And now, according to the statistics in Israel, there's 192,000 Holocaust survivors, which means that sadly, 15,000 passed away this year. And we know it's an elderly community, and they're not going to be with us longer. But we are fortunate, and we need to take advantage of that and make the most of it and not take it for granted, and do everything that we can to get close to Holocaust survivors, to support them who need our help, and just to be appreciative that we have them in our lives today. So I really am glad to be able to introduce Rabbi David, who will share some Torah thoughts with us and maybe a story, and take it away, Rabbi David.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, if anyone has a question at any time, please feel free. Before I begin, I just want to say it's an honor to be here. I have tremendous respect for Rabbi Tuly and for his initiative of building up an organization to help spread the word of God, the Torah of God, to speak to the world at large about the lands of God we refer to as Hashem. It takes great courage, and for me to have even a small amount of an alliance, an affiliation with this courageous rabbi and good friend Rabbi Tuly is really an honor, and humbly I'll say even a life accomplishment. So thank you. That being said, I am going to tell you a little bit about what Yom Hashoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, means to me, and the practical lessons that I take away from it. Perhaps I'll begin with a universal message. And that's that I originally became a guide in Poland running Holocaust tours for 2 reasons. And I've been doing this now for approximately 12 years. One of the reasons was because, like Rabbi Tuly, I am a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. As I mentioned in the pre-show, 7 out of 8 of my great-grandparents were gassed to death in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And I feel that it's essential for the Jewish people to keep their spirit alive and to make sure that their mark in history of who they were, what they stood for as religious, devout, committed worshipers of God, should not be erased with their deaths in this world. That's one reason. And I would say the second reason that I became involved is not directly connected to the Holocaust or even World War II. I found that when a group of tourists head to Poland and they hear the travesties of what happened to the Jews, and many non-Jews also, but in Poland specifically, mostly it was the Jews who suffered. And when they meet death eye to eye, and when they then hear of the miraculous story of how the Jews rose up, quite literally from ashes to the rebirth, where, as we know, 3 years after the Holocaust, the Jews returned to their homeland of Israel that they had not lived in for 2,000 years. When that miraculous story hits us in the face, so we become somewhat sobered. And we become less concerned with the materialistic Western values that are often impressed upon us. And we start to focus on something that's bigger and greater than our day-to-day lives. And I think that the ladies and gentlemen who are on this Zoom call, they would concur that when we're able to separate ourselves from the world's distractions and just focus on the nature of God's world and the hand that God plays in it, we feel so close to God. And when we feel close to him and we recognize all the wonderful gifts he gives us on a daily basis, we fall in love with him and we want to worship him. And so just to summarize that second point, I found that going to Poland gave me the opportunity and gave my students, my participants, the opportunity to focus on more meaningful matters. And once we do that, we feel an affinity towards our Creator, Hashem, our God. When I'm talking about the Holocaust on Holocaust Memorial Day, so as I mentioned, I think of how it affects my life, not only today when I'm remembering the world that was, but I also think about how the travesty of the Holocaust should affect my life 365 days a year. And there are many lessons we can take from the Holocaust. In the Holocaust, we saw the worst of the worst. We saw the world's first creation of a death factory, producing corpses. And we saw the best of the best. We saw people give up their lives for the lives of others. We saw people risk their lives for the lives of others. And there's so many lessons we can take from the Holocaust. But one that I want to focus in on that has affected my life, and I would assume also Rabbi Tuly's life, as both of us grew up in North America, Rabbi Tuly in the United States. I'm personally from Canada, but now we've settled over a decade ago, approximately a decade ago for Rabbi Tuly, we've settled in the land of Israel. We've uprooted our families. We've left our beloved parents and siblings who have yet to come on this trip. We call it Aliyah, yet to move to Israel and join us. We felt the need to do that, the need to come home. And I want to bring to you the correlation between the lessons I learned from the Holocaust and that decision that I made along with my wife to raise a family here in Israel. And that's that one of the main lessons that I learned as a Jew studying about the Holocaust is that the Jews will be successful when they adhere to the commandments they have received in the Bible. And it sounds simplistic, but to a certain extent, that's the whole story. We are a nation who are written about in the 5 books of Moses. We are given commandments, and through adhering, fulfilling those commandments, we will succeed. And in the Torah, as Rabbi Tuly knows, he published the Israel Bible. Throughout the entire Torah, the 5 books of Moses, we repeatedly hear about how the Jewish nation has a home. They belong in Israel. And this commandment is commanded by God for such an obvious reason. The reason is, taking it back to the Holocaust, because Jews throughout Jewish history have been oppressed by different nations that have risen up against them. Now, some of my best friends are Christians. I have so many Christian friends that as a rabbi, I'm embarrassed to say I wish that my faith in God was as strong as theirs. I love them, and I feel blessed to have them in my life. And this is not at all a generalization about Gentiles, heaven forbid. My point is that a tyrant, a beast, throughout history rises up against us. And for 2,000 years, when we were exiled from the land of Israel, we had no manner in which to properly defend ourselves. Where could we run to? Where could we hide? There was nowhere to go. Only through listening to that biblical commandments that was given to us when the 5 books of Moses were given to the Jewish people 3,300 years ago, only through listening to that commandment and establishing our home where we have the ability to protect ourselves, to literally pick up arms when heaven forbid we need to, only through coming home can we have a safe haven. And it's not a day where we want to point fingers at other nations of the world. However, we know that in World War II, when the primary enemies attacked us, some people call them the Nazis. I prefer not to refer to them as the Nazis. I call them the Germans. My concern with calling them the Nazis is that through doing so, people assume that it was a small group, a fringe group called the Nazis that was from Germany that oppressed and murdered the Jews. And that's not true. The Nazi Party was the German government. So rightfully, I think we should call a spade and say the Germans, when they were murdering us, and the entire world was familiar with the horrors, with the death factories. But the world did not come as swiftly and as aggressively as they should have to save us, to save 1 million, 2 million. They didn't. And we have proofs. And I want to have an opportunity for some questions, but just quickly before we head there, there was a conference in France in 1938 called the Evian Conference, where diplomats from around the world, from approximately 30 countries, gathered to discuss what to do with the German Jewish refugees that could no longer be citizens of Germany. And so countries came to discuss what are they going to do to help these Jews. They can't live if they can't be citizens of their homelands. Who's going to absorb them? The problem was recognized, but virtually none of those countries wanted to absorb us when they could have. 2 honorable mentions. It happens to be that 2 very small countries that attended that conference did agree to absorb a large amount of Jews. They were Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic. But for example, Australia was quoted at this conference saying, in Australia, we don't have a racial problem and we are not desirous of importing one. Around the same time, Canada had an infamous quote, "None is too many," about absorbing more Jews. And the Americans, Roosevelt, who called for that conference in France, he didn't do his part. History has taught us that the abandonment of the Jews was also America's responsibility. For example, there was a man from Poland named Jan Karski. Jan Karski was a non-Jew from Poland, escaped Poland during World War II to speak to Franklin Roosevelt and to beg him to save the Jews who are being murdered tens of thousands a day. And Jan Karski met with Roosevelt for over an hour. And after the meeting, he documented the dialogue they had had. And he said that throughout the 1 hour meeting, not once did President Roosevelt ask Jan Karski specifics about the welfare of the Jews. However, Roosevelt did during that meeting ask Jan Karski, how are the Polish horses managing during World War II? And Adolf Hitler, he knew about the Evian conference. He knew that there were countries discussing maybe they're going to construe a plan to help the Jews. And he issues a press release in 1938 before the murder of the Jews commences. Right? The Jews are not murdered at large until 1941, until 3 years later. Adolf Hitler in 1938 releases a press release saying, anyone who wants my Jews, my German Jews, not only can you have them, but I'll send them to your given country on luxury ships. But no one took him up on that offer. No country came to bring us, to bring my grandparents, to bring Rabbi Tuly's grandparents salvation. And that's why we know, that's why we understand the truism of God's commandment that the Jews belong in the Holy Lands that God gifted them with in the Bible 3,300 years ago. We need to live in that land peacefully. But if need be, once again, heaven forbid, we have to have the ability to physically defend ourselves. I'm not sure if anyone has any questions before I continue. Rabbi Tuly, anything specific that you'd like to inquire about?
Well, I think that you said it very well. And the Jewish people throughout our history have always been a nation that dwells alone. And that's how we were described. And that's a blessing and a curse. It's a curse because our enemies always kept us very separate and didn't want anything to do with us. But it was a blessing because it caused us to really create strong communities with each other and to stay separate from the outside world and the foreign influences, and to really focus exclusively on our study of the Torah. And as a result, we developed a really laser-like focus on the Torah and a deep love for the Torah, great wisdom, Torah wisdom that we would perhaps not have developed. And we know that the second that sort of we had the opportunity to be more integrated in the world, so God certainly knew what he was doing by keeping us the nation that dwells alone. But today, like you said, we have Israel. And so we are not in exile, scattered at the mercy of the other nations. We're also fortunate, the second thing that we're fortunate today, unlike any other time in our history, is that we are no longer a nation that dwells alone, hated by all of the other nations. There's so many people today, so many nations, so many non-Jews who love the Jewish people, and that's really, really unique to our generation. Something that we should really celebrate. And the fact that many non-Jews are connected with Israel 365, or connected to Israel through Israel 365, and are even participating in this call or watching it on online later. So those are the kinds of people who are a miracle. And if we would have had friends like we have today during the time of the Holocaust, then certainly there would have been no Holocaust. And if we would have had Israel 75 years ago, 80 years ago, then certainly there would have been no Holocaust. But nevertheless, we're fortunate that we have that today. And it's Yom Hashoah, and we have to really think about all of these things very deeply. And today I actually had the opportunity to spend time with Holocaust survivors. It's not really well known, and you're an expert in the Holocaust and the history. Do you ever have an opportunity to meet with Holocaust survivors, Rabbi David?
That's a good question. I do. On occasion, I interview Holocaust survivors, and I videotape the interviews so that we can have them documented. For example, one of our projects is that, let's say we know of a camp in Poland where a specific survivor was from. So we'll go and we'll interview that survivor. And then on our trips to Poland, we'll try to go to that town, and we'll be able to project a video of that survivor talking about his life in that town before the war, or heaven forbid, the suffering he endured in the town during the war. And that's a media piece that really helps us connect to these towns and understand what took place there prior to and during the war, as opposed to just speaking or quoting. Unfortunately, time is limited. I really wish that I had more opportunities, more time to speak to survivors. I know that it's like in life, the saying, you miss it most when it's gone, and they're dwindling, as you mentioned in your introduction. So sadly, I foresee that this is going to be a regret that I have in my life in a few years from now, that I didn't take more advantage.
Well, what about your own grandparents? Your own grandparents went through the Holocaust. Did they share their stories about the war with you?
So my grandparents, for the most part, didn't speak about it. My grandparents, they all passed away approximately 10 years ago. And they were all 90s. I think that the idea of survivors speaking about the Holocaust, the concept only became more widespread approximately 15, 20 years ago. I think before that, it was like a trauma that people didn't want to, so to speak, let out of the box. They wanted to move on. They didn't know how to deal with their post-trauma stress. And with the trips to Poland that started after the fall of communism in the end of the 1980s. So I think that the youth, especially that were going, they were coming back and talking to their grandparents who were still alive and had endured the stories that they were hearing when they were in the concentration camps in Poland. And I think slowly it became more commonplace for the generation of the Holocaust to open up and to share stories. And it wasn't, considered something that is behind us. We're not going to touch that. But I think it took time. It took a lot of time. And I think that at that stage already, my grandparents were quite old. So unfortunately, the stories we heard were very limited. I think probably for their mental health, at that point, for them to start bringing it up when they were nearing their 80s and 90s, I think it would have been harmful. Personally, just to think about, right, that that basically everyone you knew for example, if you lived in Poland, so 90%, even a little bit more than 90% of all the Polish Jews were murdered in a span of 5 years. So almost everyone your family, right, they were brought to death factories or shot in a forest. So it's
Right.
just unspeakable.
Yeah, I know that the same thing with my grandparents. They weren't quite as they weren't quite like you're describing, but they would talk about it when we would ask. However, just this week to kind of reiterate what you just said, when I asked my grandmother, who thank God is alive and well and living in Ohio, if she would share some of her testimony with my children. And she said, I just can't do it. I just can't do it. She said, it gives me nightmares every time I think about it deeply, every time. She said, I'm always thinking about it, but whenever I have to sort of tell those stories, I can't sleep for days. And, she's really, I talk to her as much as I can. I try to call her every day, especially now with the coronavirus, the isolation, that anyone who's elderly has to stay home. And so by definition, all Holocaust survivors have to stay home all day, every day. And so that isolation that they are feeling and living with today is often very harsh. I don't know, there's been articles in the newspaper and studies that are being undertaken that it's like really traumatic for Holocaust survivors to hear about food shortages and for Holocaust survivors not to be able to leave their homes. And, those bring up, it might not sound like a big deal to me or you, but for somebody who's had the kind of trauma that Holocaust survivors have lived through, anything to trigger a post-traumatic, incident. And so it's unfathomable what they went through, and it's even hard to put yourself in their footsteps today.
Yeah, that's very true. It's interesting that you mentioned that. My wife's grandmother is still alive and quite lucid. She's in her early 90s. And my wife's family has a weekly family chat now that we have on Zoom. I don't know if it's called the chat. I don't know the lingo so well. As I get older, I'm losing all the cool hip words, but I don't know what a Zoom party, maybe they call it a Zoom party. I don't know. But they have that now since Corona started. So once a week, they have this Zoom party. And my wife's grandmother got on to the computer and she seems very happy. She happens to have a helper in the house with her and her husband, who's not as lucid. He lives in the house. So she's not isolated. So she's not enduring the same type of suffering that you mentioned, but she's in good spirits. And she said, listen, this is terrible, but this isn't something specifically against the Jews. And we're not running and hiding. So relative to what we endured in the Holocaust, right, we should be happy. The whole world right now has a huge challenge and it's difficult, but right now we can talk freely and we still have food in the refrigerators. So it was interesting to hear, like you mentioned, there are some survivors who are talking about the similarities. It's not that this is a Holocaust by any means, but there are reminders, right, that get triggered of concerns and a tragedy befalling mankind that's make the similarities accurate, but at the same time this is just the opposite, right? This is the exact opposite type of tragedy where to be a hero, like they said, right, you got to sit on your couch, right? And that was by no means the Holocaust.
Right. Yeah. I remember being in Poland with you, and we were in Auschwitz, at one of the barracks where my relatives died and your relatives were also killed. And I went there with you, and my grandparents had asked me, if you're going to go to Auschwitz, will you say the memorial prayer? They never went back. They would never want to go back. And I remember that you said the memorial prayer in Hebrew, and it was very, very moving. And because of Hashoah today, and we're remembering, can we conclude with a prayer in Hebrew? Can you read that for us?
Absolutely. It will be an honor to conclude in that way. And once again, with the objective, as you mentioned, to not abandon the victims, but it's the opposite. It's not remembering their deaths today, but we're going to conclude with remembering what they lived for. And they lived for the service of God, the worship of God, and their souls now, as much as their death, their murder in this world was a tragedy, their souls now we know are in a better place. And so I think it's very befitting. I'm going to pull up here just a specific prayer that we have for the
in English and in Hebrew.
Oh, you would like it? Okay, we could do that. We'll start in Hebrew, and then we'll go to. I'm sure we'll find one in English. Just do a quick search after. El malei rachamim, shocheim bameromim, hamitzei menucha nechona, al kanfei hashechina, b'malos kedoshim utehorim, Kizoar harakia mazhirim et kol haneshamot shel sheshet milyonei haYehudim chalalei hashoah be'Europa shenehergu shenishchetu shenisrefu v'shenisfu al kiddush Hashem bidei hamaratzchim hagermanim hanazim v'ozreihem mishar ha'amim Lachein ba'al harachamim Yastireim b'seiser kenafav liolamim. Vitzror hachayim es nishmoseihem. Adonai hu nachalasam began Eden tehei menuchasam. V'yamdu legoralam leketz hayamin v'nomar amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you.
Just search quickly here to try to get the English equivalent.
Sorry if I put you on the spot.
No. It's listen. You know what? You're giving me an opportunity to do something meaningful for our great-grandparents, for what our grandparents endured also. Some of their souls are already up in heaven. So no problem. You put me on the spot any day. I'll do my best. I'm gonna try to improvise a little bit to make sure that it's a little bit more accurate. So we'll do a little slowly. And thank you again for this opportunity. God, full of compassion, who dwells in the heights, provide a fitting resting place upon the wings of your presence, with the ascents of the holy and the pure, who shine like the starry heaven, for our 6 million sisters and brothers who lost their lives in the Holocaust, that were killed and slaughtered suffocated by poisonous gas and buried alive. The young and the elderly, women and men, leaders and simpletons, those faithful in Bible study, along with the more rebellious, along with the dreamers, beloved and pleasant in life, and not separated from that love even after death. Master of compassion, safeguard them in your wings forever, and bind their souls in the everlasting matrix of life. May they rest in the Garden of Eden. May Hashem, our God, be their inheritance, and may they rest in peace, may be presently lying. May their righteousness be a source of merit for all of us, for their children, for all of the Jewish nation, and for those who fight for freedom, justice, and peace. And let us say, Amen.
Amen. Very nice.
Amen.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Really my
And,
pleasure. Thank you everyone for joining.
Yeah. And I hope that everyone who's watching this feels connected more to the Holocaust. And I really appreciate, Rabbi David, your time today. And shalom.
Honor and a pleasure. God bless you all. God bless you from the Holy Lands.